Our next story is from Africa, from the turbulent West African Sahel region. The area is famous for two things these days: military coups and terrorism. 3 West African nations have seen coups in the last 3 years: Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. But these coups were partly a result of terrorism. Groups like Qaeda and the Islamic State have a strong presence in these countries. The terrorists have been wreaking havoc for over a decade, and the civilian governments could not deal with them. That is partly why the militaries orchestrated coups. The soldiers thought that once they took control, they could fight the terrorists more effectively. That hasn't really worked, though. Instead, it's the terrorists who have benefited. They're making territorial gains, and they may even form a new state in the Sahel. Our next report has the details.
What comes to mind when you hear the phrase terrorist hotspot? Which country do you think of? For India, it's Pakistan. Pakistan will point the finger to Afghanistan. Israel will name Gaza, Iran, Syria, Yemen, and probably a few more. The US will name all of the countries mentioned and add Iraq to the mix, because that is where they fought most of the so-called war on terror, starting with Saddam Hussein and later the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, abbreviated to ISIS. ISIS gained global attention back in 2014. The group had conquered large parts of Iraq and Syria and proclaimed a caliphate there. It took years to dismantle this terror state. Everyone fought against it: the Americans, the Russians, the Iranians, Germany, Italy. ISIS was an enemy to the entire world, and it was finally crushed in 2019. But fast forward to 2024, and ISIS is rearing its ugly head once again, but maybe not where you'd expect. ISIS isn't gaining territory in West Asia, but in West Africa instead, in 3 countries in the Sahel: Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. This is the new stronghold of ISIS, or rather one of its branches. Instead of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, this is the Islamic State Sahel province, the ISSP. This was once a random group of ISIS sympathizers. They pledged themselves to the ISIS caliphate in 2015, but the caliphate didn't officially recognize them till 2022. By which point, the caliphate had mostly collapsed. But even without recognition, ISSP was wreaking havoc in the Sahel, alongside other terror groups, like a local affiliate of Al-Qaeda called the JNIM. Together, the JNIM and ISSP have carved up large parts of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. They've been running rampant for around a decade, and they've slowly expanded their control. This has caused political upheavals in the Sahel states. Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger all saw military coups. Every time, the militaries justified them by saying that the civilian governments were not doing enough to stop the terrorists. The juntas cut ties with their former Western allies, like France and the US. Instead, the juntas are working with Russia. Russian mercenaries are helping the juntas fight the JNIM and ISSP. But despite this, the terrorists keep gaining ground. They control vast swathes of territory outside the major cities, and they look like they're on their way to creating a new caliphate based in West Africa. The US is alarmed at this development. Top American counterterrorism officials say that this is a long-term threat to US interests. They believe that if a new caliphate is allowed to appear in West Africa, it could be used as a launchpad for attacks on other parts of the world. A West African caliphate could stage attacks against Europe and even the mainland US. American officials are worried about this, and they're also frustrated because no one seems to be paying enough attention. They say the CT world gets it, but most of Washington is consumed by Ukraine or China or the Israel crisis. If we let this threat in the Sahel metastasize, we'll really come to regret it. Western forces have been kicked out of the region. The juntas ruling Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger are working with Russia instead. But Russia is fighting a full-scale war against Ukraine. It can't spare the thousands of troops needed to eliminate the terror groups in the Sahel. If the war in Ukraine ends, Russia may be able to crush the JNIM and ISSP. But until that happens, the West African terrorists have a free run, and they're on their way to becoming a new global menace.